football killed my love of football. I take a slightly different view. Ultimately, the entire Saudi sport project is about internal security. Sport doesn't rule the world.
Welcome to the Football Economy, the podcast where we break down the business, politics, and power plays shaping the beautiful game. I'm Ibrahim.
And I'm Martin. Together we'll take you deep into the forces redefining modern football, from billionaire takeovers to state-backed investments and, of course, shifting sponsorship landscapes.
Right. To kick off the series, we couldn't have asked for a more distinguished guest. Joining us today is Professor Simon Chadwick, a global authority on sports, geopolitics, and business. With over 2 decades of experience, he has advised FIFA, UEFA, and major football clubs like FC Barcelona. His research delves into how politics, economics, and power dynamics are shaping the future of football. Today, he's here to unpack one of the game's most significant transformations, football's increasing intersection with geopolitics.
Simon, welcome to the Football Economy. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. I was just about to take a sip of tea, but thanks for inviting me. It's good to be here. I am English, so I've got to drink tea, right, during a podcast?
Of course.
Okay.
Sounds good. Right. So Simon, let's start with the bigger picture. So I would say, what initially drew you to the intersection of sports, geopolitics, and economics?
Because I've always been interested in football and sport, and I've always been interested in politics and economics, and I retain a massive interest. Probably what I'm most interested in is countries and the way in which different countries do different things and how they make decisions, what their cultures are, what their norms are. So I've been very fortunate, particularly over the last 10 or 15 years, where all of these things seem to be coming together. I started out as an economics student. My first degree was economics, and subsequent to that, I eventually studied for a PhD, which was in football shirt sponsorship. And for a long time, those football shirt sponsorships were probably what a lot of us are familiar with, burgers and fries and banks and beer. And then suddenly it began to change. And we saw, for instance, state entities, airlines, for example, beginning to extensively engage themselves with not just football, with sport more generally, big dollar deals with the likes of Real Madrid and Arsenal, and many others. And it was at that point that I started to think, okay, something's changing in the world. And following on from that, I started to spend a lot of time in principally in East Asia and West Asia. I spent a lot of time in China and also a lot of time in the Gulf region. And we're not talking about in recent years, we're going back 20 years ago. And it was interesting to be in places like China and Qatar at that time, because there was something sort of familiar. So it was still about money and sport and raising awareness. But at the same time, you could see that the government in those countries was playing a very prominent role, not just in matters of sport policy, sport strategy, but even regarding which logos would appear on a shirt, or which players would be signed to play for teams. And so out of that came what I now call geopolitical economy of sport, which is this intersection of not just politics and economics, but also geography. I think geography really shapes sport in ways that many people don't perhaps think. But I don't just confine this to geography, politics, and economics. This is all embracing because it also embodies tech developments. We're seeing that some of the biggest investors in tech right now are China and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, the kind of countries that I mentioned. But I think also that this term geopolitical economy of sport it's about culture and lifestyle and social change, cultural phenomena, environmental change, which is obviously one of the things that we're beginning to see, not just in terms of how sport is consumed and how it's staged, but let's be honest about it. The reason that Saudi Arabia is spending huge amounts of money on sport right now is to create some resilience in its economy, because we are exposed to climate change. We are kicking back against oil and gas consumption. And so where I am now, how can I sum it all up for you? Well, look at what Trump is doing in the United States. There's probably a lot of sports fans in the world right now just sat there thinking, well, we see this guy, we see what he's doing. We may or may not agree with it. What does it matter for sport? Well, actually, it matters a lot. And even down at the very micro level, in 2026, the ability for people to move from Mexico into the United States, into Canada to watch games at the World Cup will be dictated by Donald Trump. So this is not geopolitics as some kind of abstract or esoteric concept. This is about the kind of frontline realities of a very complex and very sensitive world in which we live.
Very,
Right.
very interesting. And so probably like delving a little bit deeper in what you just said is why do you think that football wields such unique geopolitical and economic influence compared to other global sports? And you have like already said about Trump, and how does this affect it?
As we already know, and many people say this, and they've said this not just for decades, but for centuries, is that football is the people's game. We know that pretty much most, not all countries, but pretty much all countries across the world have some sort of engagement with football. It's a very simple game, right? You need something round to kick and you need some goals, and that's it. End of story. And now, obviously, if you want to introduce VAR and offsides and rules around squad size, that's something else. But fundamentally, this is a very simple game, and you don't have to explain it to people. And so the barriers to entry into football are limited. You guys are business school students. I'm sure you've studied sports, or you've studied industries where there are barriers to entry, which means that new competitors can't enter the market. It's actually quite difficult for them to do that. Not football. You stage a game anywhere in the world and someone will watch it. And so, without wanting to sound too cliche, this is a global language. Now, what that enables, I think, is whether we're talking about using football for soft power purposes to enhance a country's attractiveness, or we're looking at football, for example, from a tech investment perspective. Most people will immediately understand what you're talking about, and most people will have a sense of what the opportunities, political, commercial, or otherwise, might be associated with the game. And so this is not an industry like other industries. You don't need lots of you don't need billions and billions of dollars to invest necessarily. There are degrees to which you can enter the industry and grab attention and really engage people, without much political power, without much money. Obviously, the more power you have and the more money you have, the bigger the impact you can make. But we're seeing, for example, you look at Baller League in Germany,
Yeah.
which 5 years ago, most people in the world would have said, "What the hell's Baller League?"
Yeah.
But we've seen how quickly, if you've got a good idea and you know how to navigate the industry, it's relatively easy to establish a presence fairly quickly.
Yeah, I'm going to pull a thread there with regards to Baller League, just to go off script a little bit. Do you think, what is the end play for them? Do you think it's the play to sell to the Saudis? Because the Saudis, that's really where, that's kind of where they might end up going when it comes to diversifying the economy.
What I know, I'm old now. I'm old, and I don't want to say it, but I'm going to say it. I've seen it all before. So I've for example, in the 1990s, when I was really starting out on my academic career, and we had the .com boom, and some of the things that were happening in sport generally, but football specifically, it was a frenzy. It was crazy, and there were speculators and opportunists circling around football, like a new Klondike, because everybody believed that from websites you're going to make huge amounts of money from websites. That was the kind of narrative in the 1990s, and this has been repeating. We've seen it most recently, I guess, with, for example, NFTs. Suddenly, football NFTs, wow, and the speculators descend. But there's something Darwinian about all of this, which is that it's the survival of the fittest. And so there may be huge interest initially from a lot of different organizations, but ultimately what you tend to find is that markets do tend towards domination, ultimate domination by a relatively small number of producers.
Right.
And so what I see with my ancient eyes through my incredibly strong glasses is same thing happening again with short format sports. Same thing happening again. Suddenly everybody's got a short format sport. Now, obviously those short format sports have been created to appeal to particular segments of a growing market, but nevertheless dynamics typically tend to dictate that markets become less competitive as they grow and develop and mature. And out of those markets, you do get your giants like Google and Meta and many others. If we obviously could talk about Bowler League, we could talk about Kings League, we could talk about DAZN's Infinity League. We may see more. In fact, I'm aware of more out there in the world that are slightly, formatted in slightly different ways and are staged in slightly different ways and perhaps have slightly different commercial deals. But I think ultimately, if you're saying, well, timing, a short format sport in 10 years' time, what will it look like? Probably 2 or 3 leagues at most. Global footprint. Appealing to mass markets. Your question about Saudi Arabia is an interesting one because, of course, the Public Investment Fund has taken a stake in DAZN. And DAZN is the owner of the Infinity League. So I don't see Saudi Arabia taking an investment in Bowler League. But that's not to say, for example, the Qataris won't, or maybe Dubai won't, or perhaps might be one of the US big US private equity investment companies taking a stake. But no, I think the Saudi Arabians through DAZN and the Infinity League already have their short format football tournament.
For sure, that's so interesting. Also, next gen ATP are also in there. We don't have anymore these 5 setters that we used to have so long ago. Well, it's tennis, but it's also like in this short format sports.
Well, I'll give you a world exclusive, Martin. I don't really watch live sport anymore. I just don't have the time. I don't have the time. I've got other things to do. Keep in mind that I am English, and I remember when I was a kid sitting down for 5 days to watch test match cricket. And test match cricket, what an amazing thing! You play for 5 days, and at the end of 5 days, it's a draw. Incredible. So now for me, I don't have 5 days. And the other thing is when I watch sport, I want a result. I don't want to draw. I don't want the rain to ruin it. And what I think, obviously the market as a whole, the market consists of people like me who are looking for an exciting outcome, an engaging product, but also delivered in a way that is suitable and appropriate to my needs, to my lifestyle. I'm sure I get fired. If I take 5 days off watching cricket, I get fired for doing that. So this is the world that we all live in now.
Yeah, shifting landscape, no doubt about it. So another question that we had is, so we believe there's a growing ideological divide between like the Western Europe's traditional clubs, football or business model, and the now or newly state-backed football projects in the Gulf or China or the US. What are your thoughts about this? How do you feel this will change the industry and the sport?
So if you were to come to one of my classes, as a master's student, what I would probably be telling you is forget about the sport. Because I think a lot of people who are fans of sport and maybe some people who work in sport seem to think that sport rules the world. Actually, it doesn't. It doesn't. Sport doesn't rule the world. It's something that distracts us from the realities of the world. And the reason for saying that is that there are some big shifts taking place in the world right now. We're obviously living through a big digital shift right now. This is not just specific to sport. It cuts across everything, every aspect of our lives. I refer to these shifts as giga changes. So we have digitalization, we have climate change, and the responses that we're all of us, countries included, are making to climate change. And we also have the remnants, and this is what's particularly interesting in this moment. I think we have the remnants of what was a global financial system and a global view of business. That is changing. Obviously, Trump is changing that very, very quickly. He's disrupting that. But I think the sense of globalization, digitalization, and environmentalism are really having profound impacts on everything that we do. And in conjunction with these 3 mega trends, over the last 30 years is we've seen the rise of China, kind of a post-communist China. We've also seen the likes of Qatar. Back in 1995, Qatar was not too far out of independence from British protection. So Qatar in many respects was a relatively new country at that point. And of course, you go back to 1995, we only just got the internet. We didn't have social media. And so some of the digital changes that was beginning to emerge have had profound consequences for us now. Now, in combination, all of these things have started to lead to a pivot in the world. And we're pivoting from global north to global south. And you can see this everywhere. We're probably talking to each other now on Chinese manufactured headphones, on Chinese manufactured laptops, probably with an American brand logo on the back of the laptop somewhere. And this is globalization. It's also digitalization. And we also know now, and Donald Trump keeps talking about rare earths in Ukraine, but if it wasn't for those rare earths, which has an environmental consequence, we wouldn't even have laptops because we couldn't make laptops without rare earths. So these big things that are happening inevitably have an impact on all of us every day in all aspects of our lives, including sport and football. The example that I often put to my students of how the world of sport is changing is have a look at the 1980 Formula One World Championship calendar. Most of the races took place in Europe. Take a look at the 2025 Formula One World Championship calendar, and very few of those races now take place in Europe.
Right.
And so that I think helps to illustrate and one of the key features of this changing world. Believe me, I could go on for days and weeks and months and years talking about this. But is ideologically we've got this kind of North American liberal free enterprise capitalist sports model, and what we've also got in places like China, Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere in the world is a much more state-led model. Somewhere in the middle are Europeans, and I think it's probably, given that you're in Berlin, it's probably appropriate and apt to talk about the Europeans. We're social democrats. So, broadly, we're social democrats. So we're not heavy on state intervention, but equally, we're not rampant free marketers in the same way as you might find in the United States. And so, I think what we've seen in Europe is we're kind of caught between two very interesting places. European Union sports policy and strategy up until now has essentially been about health and exercise. That's essentially what it's been about. But now what Europe is faced with is what does the shape of our industry look like, or what is it going to look like in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 20 years' time? Keeping in mind that in British motorsport alone, just British motorsport, there are 41,000 people working in the sector. So, for Europeans, there's some really big decisions to be made because there's money and jobs and tax contributions and investment and GDP growth centered upon sport and football. And these are the kind of issues that we need to think about. So I didn't answer your question at all there, but I hope I gave a flavor of some of the changes that we're facing.
Yeah, I think you covered a lot there that we are going to follow up on during the conversation. But just to go back to Saudi Arabia specifically when it comes to the Gulf power play, I know you mentioned soft power. So specifically in Saudi Arabia, how realistic is it, considering what MBS's grand vision for the Saudi diversification plan for the economy is, for sports to be at the center of Saudi Arabia's diversification plan? Is that realistic? I mean, in terms of the timescale they put out, I think 2030 roughly. Do we see the future of sports being all sports being held in Saudi Arabia, or is it considered still far-fetched at this moment in time?
So again, I take you back to something I said earlier, which is many people seem to think this is sport is the beginning and the end of the world. Sport rules, okay? Not really. Even in the biggest domestic sport economy in the world, which is the United States, sport accounts for only 3% of GDP. So we're not talking about we're not talking about manufacturing or oil extraction. Just to add to that, keep in mind in Saudi Arabia, 40% annually of Saudi GDP is accounted for by oil and gas production.
Right.
So there's no way in a million years that sport in Saudi Arabia is going to replace the Saudi oil and gas industry. It's just never going to happen. Sport is not a big enough proposition to sustain an entire economy on its own. So therefore, what we've got to look at is what else Saudi Arabia is doing, and it is seeking to become a leader in artificial intelligence, in other digital technologies, in solar energy and so forth. And so sport is merely, and I do emphasize that word, despite the big numbers that people are talking about around Saudi sport, sport is merely just one part of a wider national development strategy. So let's not get carried away too much on Saudi and sport. Nevertheless, 3% of the Saudi GDP, 3% of Saudi GDP from sport annually by 2030. Is still an industry of significant size, a multi-billion dollar industry. And so what we are beginning to see, or what we have been seeing over the last decade, is the essentially the strengthening of the Saudi sport ecosystem to an extent whereby it looks like what Germany has, and it looks like what Britain has, and it looks like what the United States has. Now, again, what a lot of people tend to do is they look at Saudi Arabia and think, oh my god, this is incredible. What people don't do is to look at Germany, for example, and I think Germany has the third or maybe fourth, fifth largest sport economy in the world. Nobody ever actually steps back and thinks, well, Germany has created this. You think about Adidas and Bayern Munich and Audi, and they're all members of the sport ecosystem. In simple terms, what Saudi Arabia is trying to do is replicate what Germany has and replicate what the United States has. I guess there are two key features that I would highlight in Saudi Arabia that are really significant is number one, it's state-led. So we know the German sport industry, and for that matter, the British sport industry, the US sport industry grew more organically, perhaps with significant business investment, certainly in the United States. So the Saudi economy is state-led. And the other key characteristic, and I think this is the breathtaking dimension, is just how quickly they're trying to do it.
Right.
So you think about elite professional football in Europe. We started doing this in the mid-19th century, right? You look at clubs established in England in the 1860s and 1870s. You look at Schalke in Germany, 1904. So we've been doing this for decades, whereas Saudi Arabia is trying to do it in one decade, let alone one century. So I think that's the breathtaking part of all of this. So I do think that despite all the hype, the speculation, we do need to keep a sense of proportion, because Saudi Arabia is not trying to take over the world. All it's trying to do is to replicate what we already have.
Right. I mean, that's a good take. I would say, in terms of a sense of proportion, what do you think about the avalanche of commentary around Qatar, for instance, hosting the World Cup, and Saudi specifically, pushing into the sponsorship arena, in terms of the Saudi airline, but also in terms of buying Newcastle, specifically around the terminology sport washing. Do you think it's overplayed? Is it overhyped? Is there a leniency to it, or do you think it's more complex than sport washing? Is it even more, are there racial undertones to it, to try to balance out the other side of things? What do you think from your perspective?
So let me just take a step back to your last question, because I think this provides a lead into your next question about what's happening. If I was to ask you about what are the sports capitals of the world, historically you would have said to me, well, maybe Lausanne, it's the sports governance capital of the world. Maybe New York, the sports finance capital of the world. Some people talk about Melbourne in Australia as being the sport event capital of the world. You look at Asia, or you look at Africa, and you ask, well, which countries in Asia and Africa are the sports capitals of the world? Certainly 10 years ago, I couldn't have told you. I couldn't have told you the sports, an African sports capital of the world, or an Asian sports capital of the world. I couldn't tell you that. Now we can, because Saudi Arabia is absolutely making a play as Asia's as Asia's most influential and biggest sport economy, possibly. So, Riyadh becomes a sport capital of the world. In Africa, we know, for example, Rwanda, maybe Morocco, they could be seen as sports capitals of the world. So, 10 years ago, and I would argue possibly even now too, there's a vacancy for, which is Asia's predominant sports capital. Is it Riyadh? Is it Beijing? Is it Doha? Is it Mumbai? Is it Seoul? Is it somewhere else? Now, of course, what I think that Saudi Arabia and those other Gulf countries have done is they've spotted an opportunity. So in terms of in terms of the kind of simple rules of industries and markets, is you spot a gap in the market, which they've done. They've spotted a gap in the market, and now they're trying to position themselves as an important hub for economic and industrial activity. We already know, and we've alluded to this already, about the economic diversification argument. That, I think, is overplayed quite a lot. It's only 3% of GDP at most in the United States. So I think that is overplayed. But nevertheless, there's still money and jobs in sport, and the likes of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Dubai, Abu Dhabi want to take advantage of this. We very often, we all find ourselves in conversations with people who talk about sport for good. Sport can change things. Well, that's absolutely what is happening in Saudi Arabia. We know that Saudi Arabia, under previous rulers, has been a very austere, conservative place to be. And so the country is going through a program of transformation, one part of which is sport, and sport is helping to drive that transformation. And we're already seeing outcomes. For example, women can now go to gyms, and women can now go to football matches. And there are various Saudi women's sports teams. A lot of the senior officials in Saudi sport, chief executives, presidents, and so forth, are now women. So there is a transformation agenda there. At the same time, if you're asking me, Simon, can sport be used to manage image and reputation around the world of a country? Yeah, of course. Ibrahim, you're from Nigeria. You know what the British did, right?
I do.
Yeah,
I do.
and you know what the British did in South Africa. There's a reason that the Indians love cricket. So it's not as though Saudi Arabia has kind of invented something new. Going back to gladiatorial times, sport has been used for the purposes of managing image and reputation. It's only very recently that we've labelled this sport washing. And it's not the Saudi Arabians, or for that matter, the Nigerians, or the Chinese, or the Indians, or the Brazilians, or it's not them who've labelled this sport washing. It's countries in the global north. And I think that whether you label something as sport washing or not often depends upon where in the world you sit, because we socially construct this notion of sport washing. What I find interesting about sport washing is people like Martin and me, we seem to think that we're the target for Saudi Arabia's investment in sport. Saudi Arabia is trying to fool us into thinking that this is a great country and it's changed and it's different. And I take a slightly different view. Ultimately, the entire Saudi sport project is about internal security. And a couple of weeks ago, we actually had a statement from Mohammed bin Salman talking about the lost years of extremism.
Right.
So basically, if you go back to 2001, the Twin Towers, the legal action taken against Saudi Arabia, the reputational damage that extremism inflicted upon Saudi Arabia. Fast forward then to kind of 2010, 11, 12, 13, Arab Spring across the Middle East and North Africa. So what I think Mohammed bin Salman understands, given the relatively young population of Saudi Arabia, you're talking about 70% under 35 years old, is that unless you allow a 26-year-old to use Instagram and go to raves and watch brilliant football matches and be allowed to go to the gym, that could lead to social unrest. And social unrest is costly, but more than that, social unrest poses a threat to the prevailing autocracy within Saudi Arabia. In other words, the royal family. So I think, whatever we think as people in the global north, that really oversimplifies a much more complicated picture inside Saudi Arabia. which is about internal security. And I mentioned 26-year-old Saudi Arabians. Keep in mind that the average age of an Arab Spring protester in 2012 was 26 years old. So what Saudi Arabia doesn't want people doing, what Saudi Arabia wants people doing is going to see WWE and UFC and watching Formula One and seeing Cristiano Ronaldo and watching Al Hilal win the Asian Champions League. Because when they're doing that, there are more positive outcomes than having groups of 26-year-olds on the streets protesting against the royal family. So fundamentally, this is about security.
For sure. And one of the terms that you coined in your Substack articles was that the sport washing, it's like a way for cognitive dissonance. And how does this enter? So I would not say that sport washing is neutral, or I wouldn't classify it as something that just happens in the world of football or in the world of sports. So
Martin, can I just say that I'm not averse to using this term sport washing, because look at my left hand now. You're not looking at you can't see my right hand, what I'm doing with my right hand, because I'm distracting you with my left hand. But it's not just Saudi Arabia that does this, and I think if we're going to use the phrase sport washing, we've got to apply it to lots of countries, including Great Britain, and not just to Saudi Arabia.
And my question in this regard would be a little bit more broad. So it's like, given that sport washing is not a neutral term or a neutral activity, what roles should fans and media play in holding these players that are doing the sport washing accountable for? How can media and fans have a say in this situation?
So as we know, in this very complicated, fractious world, that is very, very difficult and complicated to navigate, we increasingly find ourselves having to make some really important judgment calls. Now, I think we've got to ask ourselves, what are your values and what do you stand for? And what's happening in the world right now, especially with Trump, but Putin and Russia and Ukraine, the influence of the European Union, what's happening in Africa is, we don't seem to agree on much. And it does seem to be the case if as a European, if I make a political statement as an athlete publicly, possibly somebody in Nigeria or China or Venezuela or Mexico or somewhere else will say, well, why are you saying that? Why are you doing that? And so this is incredibly complicated for teams, for clubs, for athletes, for fans, to decide, what do you stand for? But where we are right now is you do have to think about, what do you stand for? Which side of the line do you stand? Because we're being forced to make those decisions every single day. Particularly, what a guy. No matter what we think about Trump, he's forcing us all to make some really profound judgments about really complicated issues. Now, the one thing that we do agree on is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, because most of our countries have signed up to those United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And so what I always recommend people to do is because we do disagree with each other quite a lot, is take a look at those Sustainable Development Goals, because we do agree on them. And the SDGs are around concern for the environment, providing equality of opportunity for women, providing good quality work, and so on and so forth. And what I want to do is I want the sport industry to more explicitly orient itself towards those United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So when countries are making investment decisions, when cities are bidding for events, when sponsors are engaging in relationships with a property, they're using the SDGs as a reference point. Big problem is, of course, is now Trump is saying, well, the United States might leave the United Nations. So what do we agree on? If we can't even agree on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, what can we agree on? But I think, to illustrate this, I am a football guy. I do like football, but I'm going to use another Formula One example. Is under the previous FIA, Global Governing Body of Motorsport president, what we began to see around 2019, 2020 is drivers like Sebastian Vettel and Lewis Hamilton appearing on the podium wearing Black Lives Matter t-shirts, wearing LGBTQ plus t-shirts, making overtly political statements. The president of that time was French. But of course we have a new president from the United Arab Emirates who said, you can't do that anymore. If you want to make a protest, you've got to come to me first to ask me whether I give my permission. Now, I make no judgment of anybody involved, but what you've got there is French, socially democratic, more liberal, European president allowing protest, and now an Emirati. United Arab Emirates has a particular set of norms, conventions, moral codes by which it functions, and he's saying, well, actually, no, we're not going to have that. And this is the world that we now live in. And trying to navigate this is incredibly difficult, and that's why people need people like me. Because I'm actually, when the match is taking place over there, I'm not watching the match over there. I'm watching over here. Who's in those corporate boxes, and which state companies are sponsoring the tournament, and where are we seeing growth markets in the global south? Because these are really shaping and reordering what we know about global sport today. And unless you really understand, for example, Rwanda, I'm guessing the three, I've never been to Rwanda. I'm guessing you've never been to Rwanda. And yet Rwanda, as we know, is a growing force in elite professional sport. And so a knowledge of Rwanda, an understanding of Rwanda, being able to operate effectively in Rwanda requires insight, and you need to know about the nuance and the politics and so forth, and that's all part of navigating this complicatedness.
Right. Yeah, it's a good segue into. I mean, we've spoken a lot about the global south, so let's transition to the global north, specifically the U.S. So I do know that we're all aware now that the U.S. has a lot of concentration of capital in European football. Chelsea, for instance, is the most recent one, I guess. Inter Milan, AC Milan, both. I think Inter Milan, had to basically forfeit their assets because of not being able to pay the interest on a loan to Oaktree Capital. But specifically, my question is really around trying to understand what sort of an impact in terms of the U.S. way of running a firm would that have on European clubs which have a different philosophy. So, for example, with the PSL, which is the personal seat licenses that Real Madrid and Barcelona have taken on as a commercial model. I think Barcelona have raised almost 700 million euros from that. Madrid a bit less, but close to that also. How does something like that affect the philosophy of football clubs going forward, especially in England?
So I tend to see elite professional sport and football specifically in terms of three time periods. So you had the 19th century into the early part of the 20th century, and this is when European football clubs were professional football clubs were established. This is when league structures and rules were formalized. You got the development of national associations leading into the early part of the 20th century, when obviously you then had the likes of UEFA and FIFA began to formalize. Very often created, in fact, exclusively created by Europeans. FIFA is a European organization. Even now, it's still based in Europe. Its president is European. Most of FIFA's presidents have always been European. The rules are shaped primarily by European sport bureaucrats, and that really was the hegemony until the last quarter of the 20th century, when we began to see US commercial practice, financial practice, beginning to impact upon football in Europe. And I'm thinking specifically here of Manchester United and Tottenham Hotspur, which floated on the London Stock Exchange in the 1980s. Then, of course, you had satellite broadcasters like News International, an American corporation. They were the first broadcasting partner of the Premier League in 1992. Now, of course, at this point, keep in mind that there was a great deal of unease amongst European football fans that football is about life and culture and community and family and identity and heritage. And you used this phrase cognitive dissonance earlier. The football that we were beginning to get in 1995 to 2000 what we thought we should be getting and what we were actually getting were two different things. And we didn't like this, and we see this still playing through now in for example Germany, where fans still regularly protest against big money in football. But certainly from an English perspective, we've reached a point now, I think, where we kind of got used to big money. So this second phase of elite professional football, the North American influence, we're kind of getting used to this. We still haven't got used to it completely, and there's still some dissent. And the independent football regulator that the British government is now trying to introduce is in part a response to that. But I think, for me, it's, you look at the reaction of fans yesterday to the announcement of Manchester United's new stadium. We love this. We love big stadiums and big venues and big experiences and big sponsorship deals and big investments because it's our club. Forget about the history and the heritage and the community and the identity and local people. So there has been, if I could characterize this second period, it's almost like there has been a grudging acceptance of football capitalism, if we put it that way. But just as we're getting used to this and this idea, we're now in a third era, which is the first quarter of the 21st century, and I find this period interesting because we began to see state involvement, and we've talked about Emirates, Emirates Airlines sponsorship, Qatar World Cup, a Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund buying Newcastle United, and it looked as though states, particularly from the global north, were going to dominate. But what I think we've seen, obviously, over the last, certainly since the pandemic years, and the pandemic was significant, is the pandemic and the financial implications of the pandemic, I think, served to turbocharge US private equity investment in football. A lot of the assets where we're now seeing investment were stressed. Revenue streams suffered, obviously, and profitability suffered as a result of the pandemic. We saw some injection of inflationary pressure into the transfer market, primarily through the Neymar transfer in 2017, and that has never really deflated. It's deflated a little, but not fundamentally. And so what we're now seeing, I think, is not just states taking advantage in this third period or this third era of elite professional football. It's not just states, it's US private equity investors too. My simple take on all of this is, to fans who think, oh my goodness, Mark Zuckerberg is going to take over my football club. We're going to be the richest club in the world. Wow. And that's the usual reaction amongst fans whose club is going to be bought by, the likes of somebody like Mark Zuckerberg is, he doesn't care about your town. He doesn't care about your club. He's a businessman and he wants to make money. And it is by all means necessary. I'll make money by all means necessary. And if you look at Wrexham and Ryan Reynolds, God bless his soul, because I think he really has had a sense of nurturing the club within the local community. But let's be absolutely clear about this. This is a business proposition for Ryan Reynolds, first and foremost. He's a really shrewd operator, a very clever entrepreneur, and that's what Wrexham is. And for most US investors, that's what football is. Your seat pricing schemes, your merchandising ranges, entertainment destinations inside stadiums. This is not 19th century Europe. This is late 20th century and early 21st century US sporting capitalism impacting upon sport.
And Professor, how can we maintain, or not we, just European clubs, how can European clubs maintain their identity while navigating in this new world? Like Elon Musk said that he was going to buy Liverpool, or what you said about Wrexham, Manchester City. It's crazy.
Driving to the very heart of everything that we've talked about today is power. Who's got it? Where do they get it from? How are they using it? And it's really interesting that if we take, for instance, the European Super League debacle in 2021, the image that sits in my mind is of Chelsea fans outside Stamford Bridge protesting against the Super League. At the time, a club owned by a Russian oligarch who is now sanctioned for his links to Putin. to be taken over subsequently by a US private equity investor. And I see a real disconnect there between who fans think they are and who they think their football clubs are, and those who actually own football clubs. For those who hanker for the days of the 19th century and football in the 19th century, then, do your own thing. People back in the, people like us, just normal people like us in the 19th century established football clubs. So whether you're a Chelsea fan or an AC Milan fan or a Bayern Munich fan, whoever you are, if you don't like football today, set up your own football club, because there's no other way that you're going to be able to deal with this. Because I think power in today's football network rests in the hands of mega rich, high net worth individuals from the United States, or oil and gas rich entities from the Gulf, with some others. And it's incredibly difficult for others to successfully enter the industry. We talked a little earlier about barriers to entry. If you don't want your club to be taken over by a US private equity investor or an oil and gas kingdom, then okay, set up your own football club. And if you can find somebody who can give you 10, 20, $30 billion to do that, then, go compete. But what we're seeing is obviously, these business people, these incredibly powerful business people, and oil-rich kingdoms have resources that we don't. And I mean, when I say we, I also include European nations in this. We don't. And they are prepared to use the resources at their disposal to pursue their own ends, which for US private equity investors is to make money, for oil and gas rich states is to extend political influence and maintain internal security. And that kind of romantic view of the past that Europeans have, I think, it's in the past. It is in the past. Or maybe it's in lower league football. Maybe it's in lower league football. Or maybe, going back to the point about short format football, maybe there are going to be opportunities for people to invest in a different way. When I drink coffee, I prefer to go to a cafe where the owner knows me and they, hey Simon, how do you want your coffee? Well, you know how I like it. I like it strong, not too much sugar, And so they make it for me, and the ambience is good, and it's cool and relaxed. It's at the corner of the street. It's fantastic. Now, if I go to Starbucks, I don't get the same thing. I get a global product that is consumed by mass audiences around the world. Now, think about that. I invite your listeners to think about coffee shops. Where do you choose to drink your coffee? Which football club do you choose to support? So there are. What I'm trying to say is there are people in the world that want something authentic and real and linked to a community and friendly and personal. And I don't think big global corporations, whether it's a football club or a coffee business, can offer those things in the same way. So I'm not saying the football that we knew in the 19th, 20th centuries is gone. You do have to search very hard to find it. It's still there, but much more significantly than that, smart people have got to think about clever ways of trying to sustain those institutions, because they're going to start disappearing soon if we don't.
It's like probably a matter of competitiveness. Like if we want to be competitive in the market trends that are ruling right now, we have to adapt to these new challenges or to this new situation. That's
at an individual level. I don't think there's very much that we can do. Actually, there is something we can do. Just don't go to games anymore. Simple. Don't go and watch Manchester United. Don't take a Sky subscription. Don't show any. That's what you can do. But of course, you're not going to do that, because there is this psychological connection with this institution we perceive as having some sort of communal or historic value. But I do, I from that, could we take coordinated action? It's actually very difficult. Because if you look at Inter Milan, for example, Inter Milan, they're doing pretty well right now, and so why would Inter Milan fans want to protest when they're doing pretty well right now? So they may not agree with Manchester United fans. If United's not doing so well, it's no business of Inter Milan fans, right? So trying to coordinate action is very, very difficult. Consumer direct action can sometimes be effective. You look at the Gap. The Gap changed its logo a number of years ago, and customers worldwide were really upset that the Gap had changed its logo, and they managed to get Gap to change its logo back to the old logo. So consumer direct action can sometimes impact, but it's very, very difficult. It's very, very difficult to establish kind of a global consensus about what should happen. My view is that FIFA should be taking a much more active role in such matters, which it is not. Ideally, we should have a United Nations for football.
Right.
I'll be the president, whereby stakeholders, including fans, have a voice, have a stake in decisions that are made that affect the future of the game. But I don't see these things happening anytime soon.
Right. Yeah, a more
Yeah.
democratic side of football. Well, so let's take a step back. So, for instance, when we're talking about football executives, I know we've spoken about state-led, intervention into football clubs. We've spoken about private capital or private equity firms, but specifically when we have like a zero lens into football executives, what would you say, given the lengthy conversation we've had today, what would you be giving them as an advice in terms of how to navigate this complex, geopolitical landscape they find themselves in?
There's no such thing as a free school lunch. So my first degree was economics. Year one, day one, hour one, they tell you there's no such thing as a free school lunch. So nobody in this world is going to come to your football club and say, here's some money. Go and buy Mbappe. It's not going to happen, because they will want something in return. So for anybody working in sport, is step back from the sport. Forget the sport. You've got to think about other things, because sport and football are actually not as important as we believe them to be. As I said, we tend to get engrossed in this. So that's the first thing. Is we don't live in a something for nothing world. Everybody always wants something. I think the second thing to say is that nothing is ever perfect. So when Saudi Arabia or Qatar or United Arab Emirates rocks up at your club and says, "Hey, we're going to give you all this money and you can buy all the players in the world that you," wow, we're in dreamland. It's utopia now. No, because there's always a downside. Equally, with US private equity investors, you're probably thinking, oh my God, they're going to squeeze the life out of our club. They're going to rinse value from our club. It's going to be a nightmare. Actually, no. US private equity investors are very, very good at getting clubs to operate in a much more efficient way. In some cases, to even be profitable and sustainable in the long term. But I'm not advocating for one or the other. Maybe there are other models. Fan ownership, for example. Fantastic fan ownership. Democratic. The club's going to be led and managed by people who are accountable to us. That's great. But we've seen, in places like Barcelona, we've seen how chaotic fan-led clubs can be. So I think there's something about nothing is ever perfect. There are upsides and downsides to everything. I think the third thing that I would say is I would like to see more creativity in sport, in thinking about new models of ownership and new models of governance and new ways of engaging with fans, so that fans do feel as though they have a stake. And at the same time, the fans not only feel as though they have a stake, but the commercial partners who are vital to the financial well-being of the organisation, they feel that they're getting value from that relationship too. So, more creative ways of addressing some of the challenges that we face. I think the other thing that I would say, the fourth thing that I would say is being more vigilant to the world around you. And I do find repeatedly that organisations in football are not especially vigilant to the way in which the world around them functions. We look at we look at some of the protests against the Qatar World Cup in Britain ahead of the 2022 tournament. We were very, very keen to protest about this and to complain about it and to bring criticisms, while at the same time Heathrow Airport, significant proportion of Heathrow Airport is owned by the Qataris, a significant proportion of British Airways owned by the Qataris, a significant proportion of Sainsbury's, one of our biggest supermarkets, owned by the Qataris. And this, I will use this word, ignorance. There is a level of ignorance generally. So I don't insult anybody in particular. So there is a level of ignorance generally about the world and what's happening in the world and what that means for us as people generally in our daily lives, but also what happens in football that people are unaware of. And when I say vigilance, we are talking about assessing risk. We are talking about environmental scanning and scanning your operating environment and really understanding what's happening. We're talking about thinking about alternative scenarios about what might happen to an organisation should something happen. I mean, a really interesting one for me, Newcastle United. I mean, this doesn't sound like this is not rocket science, but some Newcastle United fans really, really like the Saudi Arabians. And some Newcastle United fans don't. And then there are other groups, some do and some don't, and some go to games and some don't go to games, and some will still be supporters even though they don't like it. And so I think having in your mind a range of different scenarios, whether you're buying a club or whether you're signing with a particular sponsor, whether you're taking a race to Rwanda, for example, you've got to have a much sharper sense of what are the ramifications of this decision.
Simon, wrapping up, what keeps you optimistic about the future of football?
Nothing.
I feared that was going to be your answer, to be honest.
Football killed my love of football. So when I was a kid, every day after school, I kicked a ball. And when I wasn't kicking a ball, I was reading a football magazine. And when I wasn't reading a football magazine, I was putting stickers in a book. If I wasn't putting stickers in a book, I would be watching on TV or talking about football to my friends. So, for a large part of my life, I loved football. I think that the game itself, football killed my love of football. Or should I say the football industry killed my love of football. I still think it's an amazing thing to go to a public park and watch kids kicking a ball around is still just really, really, it's such a cool, and for that matter, anybody kicking a ball around in a park, it's just a really cool thing to do. So I think if you being less pessimistic in answering your question, just watching people kick a ball around in a park, in a street, somewhere, that gives me optimism for the future of football. But if you're talking about the rest of it, this gives me nightmares, not hopes.
Completely agree with what you have just said. So just we have this last section of the episode, which is rapid fire questions. It's 4 or 5 questions that you can answer actually with one word or just one sentence. So the first one would be, what's the single biggest geopolitical risk facing football today, in your view?
Donald Trump.
Okay, that's fair. Which country or region do you believe will dominate global football by 2050 and why?
Still Europe. But still Europe, but.
I think you already gave us a sense of this answer, which is, which football transfer, in your view, has had the most profound impact on the sport's evolution?
Neymar.
Definitely.
In brackets, Bosman.
Okay.
I have a 2-part question. So the first one is, what's your favorite memory from Middlesbrough, being a Middlesbrough fan?
You've done your research.
Yeah, we both did a lot of research. And then the second question is, I know you've written a lot of books, that you've published a lot of articles, you've collaborated with a lot of authors. What would be the most impactful book you've read that has shaped your view on geopolitics, economics, and sport? It's a tough one, but I would really like to have that as an answer come out from you.
On favorite memory, my dad. My dad died when I was a kind of young kid. But I remember it because my dad would always take me to the football every Saturday. So my dad, that's my favourite memory. And I guess, this is what it is for people, is, it's about family, it's about community. So my dad is my favourite memory of Middlesbrough Football Club. As regards a book, I can't tell you one particular book that impacted me. there are probably several. Football Against the Enemy from 30 years ago, Simon Cooper. I think that was a really interesting way to write about football at that point. You've got books like MBS by Ben Hubbard, which is a book about Mohammed bin Salman, has been really, really helpful. I think probably the thing that influences me the most, and this is really the only publication I read regularly at the moment, is The Economist. And I know there is a particular ideology underpinning The Economist, which if you know the ideology, you can see through some of the points that they're making. But The Economist is very balanced and very insightful in the way in which it writes about the world. Sometimes it writes about football, most of the time it doesn't. But I think for anybody trying to understand the complicatedness of now, read The Economist every week, because I think it does provide at least some sense of, I don't know if sanity is the right word, but certainly, discipline in terms of looking at things. And that sadly, in a world of social media, that sadly is very often.
Professor Simon, thank you very much. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Really, really thankful for your time, for giving us an hour of your knowledge, condensing.
We're 10 minutes over. You owe me overtime. You owe me overtime.
We do, and thanks for giving us a better perspective into everything. So actually,
yeah, thank you for inviting me. Thanks, guys.
And that's a wrap on our very first episode of the Football Economy. We'd like to thank Professor Simon Chadwick for sharing his incredible insights on how geopolitics is reshaping the beautiful game. If you found this episode enlightening, valuable, please hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Until next time, thank you.